Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about New-Historicism. New-Historicism emerged during the 1980s. New-Historicism is a literary theory and a critical methodology that emerged prominently during the 1980s, marking a significant shift in the study of literature and its entanglement with history and culture. Unlike a traditional historicism, which treats historical context largely as a backdrop or a chronological frame against which literature is set, New Historicism argues that literary text and a history are mutually constitutive, meaning literature both shapes and is shaped by the complex historical discourses, power relations, and ideological structures of its time. It contends that history is not an objective singular narrative, but a constructive and often contested process mediated by language, ideology, and power. Literary works, rather than existing as autonomous aesthetic objects, are cultural artifacts embedded in networks of social practices, institutional frameworks, political struggles, and shifting power dynamics. Thus, New Historicism insists on reading literature alongside other contemporary discourses such as legal documents, political pamphlets, religious texts, medical treatises, and popular culture to unearth the ideological operations and the cultural negotiations that define a historical period. Origins and intellectual foundations, theoretical roots and a historical moment. Emergence in the 1980s. New Historicism came into prominence chiefly in the 1980s within Anglo-American academia, especially at the institutions like Harvard University and the University of California. It emerged as a direct challenge to New Criticism's dominant formalist paradigm, which confined literary analysis to intrinsic textual features and largely excluded external historical, social, or ideological factors. Foundational influence of Stephen Greenblatt. Stephen Greenblatt, often called the pioneer of New Historicism, catalyzed the movement through seminal works like Renaissance Self-Fashioning, from More, that means Thomas More, to Shakespeare, 1980. And in this and subsequent works, Greenblatt examined how Renaissance texts actively participated in a construction of social identities, showing how literature could function as a means of shaping political and cultural power. Philosophical and theoretical antecedents. New Historicism is deeply indebted to the philosophy of Michel Foucault, whose analysis of power, knowledge, discourse, and the formation of subjectivities radically reoriented how scholars think about history and culture. Foucault's conception of history as a series of epistemes or discourse formations underscored the idea that knowledge is always bound to power relations and never neutral. Additionally, New Historicism incorporates ideas from Louis Althusser's Marx theory of ideology and interpellation, emphasizing how subjects are held or constituted within ideological frameworks. It also draws from anthropology, especially Clifford Greed's notions of culture as a system of meaning and semiotics, and a post-structuralism skepticism toward stable meanings and authorial intentions. Departure from 19th century historicism. Unlike 19th century historicism, which tended to view history as a linear progression toward truth and enlightenment, New Historicism rejects teleological universalist histories. Ray stresses that history is always partial, fragmented, and is situated within the contingencies of culture and a language. Now let's talk about the theoretical development of New-Historicism and its core principles. Text and context as interdependent. New-Historicists insist that literary texts cannot be understood in isolation from their cultural context. Moreover, context itself is not a neutral container, but an active and a contested site where meanings are produced and negotiated. Texts are simultaneously shaped by and shaping the ideologies and power relations of their time. Power, discourse, and ideology. Building on Foucauldian theory, New-Historicism focuses on how power operates through discourse, sets of statements, and practices that define what can be said, thought, or done in a society. Literature is viewed as a discursive practice that participates in the production and maintenance of social power, shaping identities, social hierarchies, and norms. Historicizing the present and historicizing texts. New historicists examine the ways historical narratives themselves are constructed and the cultural work they perform. They integrate how contemporary scholars' readings of history and literature are influenced by their own historical context, emphasizing self-reflexivity. Intertextuality and cultural networks. Rather than seeing text as isolated, New-Historicism studies them within a web of interrelated texts, literary, historical, and cultural, that reference, contradicts, and influence each other. This includes non-literary material such as legal codes, diaries, sermons, and newspapers. Microhistory and localized studies. New-Historicism often favors microhistorical approaches, focusing on specific historical moments, events, or figures rather than broad grand narratives. This approach reveals how power and ideology operate in localized everyday contexts. Rejection of authorial intent. While traditional historicism often sought authorial intention, New-Historicism aligns with post-structuralism and viewing authorial meaning as unstable and multiple, foregrounding instead how readers in a historical context construct meaning. Now let's talk about the social, cultural, and political relevance of New-Historicism. Postmodern and late 20th century context. New-Historicism arose during a period marked by a crisis of faith in Enlightenment ideals of objective knowledge and progress. The late Cold War era and the rise of postmodernism fostered skepticism toward singular grand narratives and totalizing histories. Intersections with identity politics. It coincided with and influenced critical approaches attentive to race, gender, class, and sexuality, uncovering how literature participates in both marginalizing and giving voice to subaltern groups. Challenging power structures. New-Historicism exposes the ways literature participates in legitimizing dominant ideologies and power relations, while also revealing sides of resistance and subversion within texts and historical discourses. Contribution to cultural studies. It shares affinities with the cultural studies, extending literary criticism into analysis of popular culture, media, and everyday social practices, broadening the scope of what constitutes a text. Now let's talk about the methodological practices of New Historicism. Close reading with a historical inquiry. Detailed textual analysis remains central but is complemented by rigorous investigation into the historical, political and social conditions shaping the text. Archive exploration. Scholars often delve into archival materials such as letters, legal documents, pamphlets, and art objects to reconstruct the cultural milieu of literary production. Reflexivity. Critics acknowledge the situatedness of their own interpretations and the role of criticism in reconstructing history. Cross-disciplinary. New Historicism is inherently interdisciplinary, drawing on history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and political theory. A focus on marginalized voices. It often uncovers suppressed or overlooked perspectives, especially women, colonized peoples, and other subaltern groups. Now let's talk about New Historicism's importance and influence in language and literature studies. Expanding the literary canon. New Historicism encourages the study of a wide variety of texts beyond high literature, including pamphlets, diaries, popular ballads, court records, and visual culture, thereby democratizing literary studies. Political awareness. It politicizes literary criticism by revealing literature's role in power and ideology, fostering socially and politically engaging scholarship. Interrogating historical narratives. New Historicism challenges the assumption that history is an impartial backdrop, insisting that historical knowledge is contingent, interpretive, and often ideological. Bridging literature and history. It dissolves strict boundaries between literary and historical studies, promoting a dialogic approach that enriches both fields. Influence on other disciplines. Its methodological insights have shaped fields like film studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, and art history. Now let's talk about the prominent scholars and seminal works under New Historicism. First of all, we have Stephen Greenblatt, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, 1980s, Shakespearean Negotiations, 1988. He pioneered New Historicism, exploring identity formation and a cultural power in Renaissance literature. Next, we have Michel Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Discipline and a Punish, 1975, The History of Sexuality. And Foucault developed theories of power, discourse, and knowledge foundational to New Historicism. Then we have Louis Montrose, his work Professing the Renaissance, 1989. And he applied New Historicist approaches to early modern literature and ideology. Next we have Catherine Gallagher, whose work Norbury Story, 1994, examined women's writers in a historical context and the social forces shaping literary production. Next we have Jonathan Goldberg, whose work James First and the Politics of Literature, 1983, analyzed the political and literary interrelations in early modern England. Next we have Paul Salzman, whose work Shakespeare and Social Theory, 1990, connected literature with social structures and class dynamics.